Was a long day, I know how you feel. Close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let the world outside start to fade away. Welcome back to the mental lullaby. Tonight, we aren't just looking for rest, we're giving your mind the permission it needs to let go. Using gentle psychological techniques and calming soundscapes will guide your nervous systems from the noise of the day into the quiet of the night. You have done enough for today. Now, it's time to simply be. Let's begin our journey into sleep.
How Riot scrapped the universe. League of Retcons, there's a world between worlds, a place that exists in the minds of millions, where gods walk alongside mortals and magic flows through ancient stones. This world has a name that you know, that you've heard whispered in gaming cafes and streaming channels, that's been painted across championship banners and Netflix screens. Runeterra, the universe of League of Legends. But here's something you might not know, something that sits at the heart of this sprawling mythology like a wound that never quite heals. This world has died and been reborn more times than most of its champions. I'm going to tell you a story about a universe that was scrapped, rebuilt, scrapped again, and continues to shift beneath the feet of everyone who tries to call it home. Some of you have been there from the beginning, watching as the foundations crumbled and rose again. Others discovered Runeterra through a Netflix show and wonder why longtime fans seem perpetually frustrated, always talking about what used to be, what could have been, what keeps changing without warning. This is for all of you. This is the story of how Riot Games, the company behind one of the world's most popular games, spent over a decade repeatedly retconning, rewriting, and rebuilding their universe. Sometimes these changes breathed new life into forgotten corners. Other times they left champions stranded in narrative limbo, their stories half-told or contradicting everything that came before. Through it all, millions of players tried to hold onto something solid in a world that refused to stay still. You might wonder why this matters. After all, League of Legends is a competitive game, a MOBA where gameplay trumps narrative every single match. You could play for years without reading a single champion biography or caring about why these characters fight. But there's something powerful about lore, about knowing that the champion you main has a history, relationships, dreams, and tragedies that extend beyond the Summoner's Rift. When you invest hundreds or thousands of hours into a game, when you develop attachments to characters and regions, when you follow storylines across years, the constant retcons don't just rewrite fictional histories. They rewrite your connection to this world, sometimes erasing the very things that made you care. So settle in. This journey spans from 2009 to 2024, from the founding of the Institute of War to Arcane's final season. We're going to explore every major retcon, every controversial change, every time Riot looked at their universe and decided to start over. We're going to talk about champions who were forgotten, storylines that were abandoned, and the pattern of problems that keeps repeating. Along the way, you'll understand why some fans still mourn the original lore, why others embrace the changes, and why nearly everyone agrees that Riot's approach to storytelling has been, at best, chaotic. Welcome to the ever-shifting world of Runeterra, where the only constant is change, and not always for the better. The world that was in the beginning, there was actually a League of Legends. No, I'm serious. The game you play now, where matches have no canonical explanation and champions from different eras fight for no stated reason, used to have an entire in-universe justification. Every match, every kill, every victory and defeat was supposed to mean something in the lore. The year was 2009, and Riot Games had created something unique among competitive games. A narrative framework that tried to make sense of why these battles kept happening. The world of Runeterra had nearly destroyed itself. Decades of magical warfare, rune-powered catastrophes, and conflict between nations had brought civilization to the brink of collapse. The planet itself was fracturing under the weight of devastating arcane energy. Into this apocalyptic scenario stepped the most powerful mages from across Runeterra. They gathered together and proposed a radical solution. If war was inevitable, if nations would always have disputes and grievances, Then let's create a controlled environment where these conflicts could be resolved without destroying the world. They called this organization the Institute of War, and the battles that took place under its governance became known as the League of Legends. Here's where it gets interesting. You, the player, weren't just a player. You were a summoner, a powerful mage who had been trained by the Institute of War. Your role was to channel your magic into a champion, effectively possessing them during battles that would determine political outcomes, territorial disputes, and international conflicts. The champions weren't fighting each other randomly. They were representatives of their nations, their causes, their people, bound by contract or personal conviction to fight in the league. The fields of justice were the battlegrounds where history was written, where Demacia and Noxus settled their grievances without armies, where a single match could decide tax policy or territorial borders. This wasn't just background flavor. The Institute of War was the beating heart of League of Legends identity. Riot published the Journal of Justice, an in-universe newspaper that reported on matches, political developments, and champion interactions. They created League judgments, short stories that detailed each champion's trial before being accepted into the League, exploring their psychology and motivations. When a champion joined the roster, there was an explanation for why they sought out or were recruited by the Institute. Some came for glory, others for redemption, some because they had no choice, and a few because they wanted to change the world through this new system. Take Jax, for instance. In the original lore, he was a mysterious warrior whose skill was so overwhelming that the League's High Council forced him to fight using only a lamppost as a weapon. Despite this handicap, he remained nearly unbeatable. His story was simple but evocative. A master fighter in a League of Legends, so powerful that he had to be restrained. Gragas was a jovial brewmaster who joined the League to find the perfect ingredients for his ale. Shaco was a living puppet or demon whose origins remained mysterious, but who relished the chaos of League matches. Nocturne was a nightmare given form, somehow bound to serve in these battles. Every champion, no matter how strange or powerful, had a reason to be there. The summoner's presence also explained gameplay elements that otherwise made no sense. Why could you cast Flash or Ignite? Those were summoner spells, magic that you as the summoner channeled to assist your champion. Why did matches always have 5 champions per side? The Institute's rules. Why did defeated champions respawn? The magic of the fields of justice prevented permanent death. Even the items champions bought were provided by the Institute. Everything had an explanation. For players who cared about lore, this created something special. Your actions in-game had narrative weight. When Demacia and Noxus players competed during faction events, the outcomes influenced story developments. The Ionia versus Noxus rematch determined political storylines. The Freljord Civil War event shaped an entire region's future. You weren't just playing a game, you were participating in Runeterra's history. The summoners had a place in this world, and so did you. Looking back, it's easy to see why this appealed to early players. League of Legends launched in 2009, when games like World of Warcraft dominated the MMO space with rich, evolving narratives. Players expected their online games to have stories, to have reasons for existence beyond pure gameplay. The Institute of War gave League of Legends that narrative backbone. It was unique, it was ambitious, and for a few years it actually worked. But cracks were already forming in the foundation. As Riot added more champions, the explanations for why they joined the League became increasingly strained. How do you convince an ancient star dragon like Aurelian Soul to compete in these matches? Why would Bard, a cosmic entity maintaining balance across dimensions, care about tax disputes in Valoran? What about Kindred, the embodiment of death itself? The more diverse and powerful the champion roster became, the harder it was to justify their presence in organized 5 versus 5 matches. There were also creative limitations. If every champion needed a reason to join the League, then every champion's story had to orbit around this institution. You couldn't tell stories about champions who refused to participate. You couldn't explore regions of Runeterra that didn't interact with the Institute. Every narrative had to funnel through this single organization, and for writers trying to expand the world, that bottleneck became increasingly restrictive. The Journal of Justice stopped publishing. League judgments were discontinued. Event outcomes stopped influencing the lore. The connections between gameplay and story weakened with each passing year. By 2013, the Institute of War existed primarily in champion biographies that fewer and fewer people were writing. The original vision was dying, strangled by its own ambition and the practical demands of creating content for over 100 unique characters. Something had to change. Riot's narrative team could see it. The community could see it. The question wasn't if the lore would be reworked, but how drastically Riot would be willing to tear down what they'd built. As it turned out, they were willing to tear down everything. The Great Retcon, September 2014. A dev blog appeared on the League of Legends website titled Exploring Runeterra, written by writer Tommy Knox with contributions from the narrative team. For fans following the lore, it should have been exciting news. Instead, it detonated like a bomb. The Institute of War was gone. Summoners were gone. The League of Legends, the actual in-universe league, was gone. The Fields of Justice, the entire premise that had existed since 2009, was being retconned out of existence. Everything you knew about why these champions fought, about the player's role in this world, about the narrative framework that gave the game its name, was being declared non-canon. It simply never existed. Devin Gill, another Riot writer, explained their philosophy at the time. They believed stories should spring from characters naturally, not from an arbitrary plot built around them. Character drives plot, not the other way around. The Institute of War was called a weak frame for storytelling, something that didn't matter to most players who connected with the champions themselves rather than with being a summoner. When Gill played League, as he stated, he connected with the champion, not with controlling them as some godlike entity. The narrative team argued that the League concept was restricting the potential narrative development of the game's defining characters. Knox outlined two primary factors that influenced their decision. First, the presence of summoners gave the impression that champions were little more than puppets manipulated by godlike powers, reducing their agency and making them feel less like protagonists of their own stories. Second, the requirement that every champion needed a reason to join the League limited the types of stories Riot could tell. They wanted to push character biographies and event plotlines beyond the boundaries of the League, to let champions exist in a world that didn't revolve around organized matches. On paper, these reasons made sense. Characters with agency are more compelling. Freeing writers from the constraint of explaining why cosmic entities would participate in political proxy wars opened creative possibilities. The intention was good. But the execution? That's where everything fell apart. The community response was immediate and savage. The official forum post for the dev blog was buried under hundreds of downvotes and angry comments. Every explanation the narrative team offered was met with criticism. Players felt betrayed. Some had been following storylines for 5 years, attending League-sponsored events, participating in faction wars, reading every Journal of Justice issue, crafting their own summoner identities. Now they were being told none of it mattered, none of it was real, none of it ever happened. The game was called League of Legends, but there was no longer a league. You played as a summoner, except summoners didn't exist. The map was called Summoner's Rift, but there were no summoners. You cast summoner spells, but who was casting them? The in-game announcer still referenced summoners, but they'd been erased from canon. Nothing made sense anymore. Worse, Riot didn't have replacement lore ready. The dev blog promised they would reshape champions to hold tightly to the soul of what each character was in the old canon, that the core of what made Orianna or Jax or anyone else compelling would remain intact. But they couldn't retcon every champion immediately. The post spoke about future plans, about gradually rebuilding, about new creative directions. Meanwhile, over 100 champions suddenly had no context for their existence. Some champions were hit harder than others. Jax's entire identity was built around being the strongest League fighter. What was he now? A wandering warrior with a lamppost for reasons that would remain unexplained for years. Gragas was a fun-loving brewmaster whose personality made sense in the context of League matches as celebrations. Without that framework, he became just a drunk guy who happened to be playable. Nocturne was bound to serve the League. Without the League, His motivation for fighting vanished entirely. Shaco, Fiddlesticks, these mysterious entities whose recruitment by the Institute was part of their appeal, lost their narrative anchors completely. Champions whose stories extended beyond the League fared better. Damatian champions still had Damatia. Noxian champions still had their empire. The Freljord champions had their frozen homeland and its civil war. But even they faced questions. Why would Garin and Katarina, from rival nations, fight on the same team? Without the League mandating these alliances, what explained the gameplay? Riot's implicit answer, drawn from their public statements and actions, seemed to be, don't think about it. The matches aren't canon anymore. The game exists as something separate from the lore now, functioning more like an all-star exhibition where timeline and relationships don't matter. For players who came to League for the gameplay, this barely registered. The competitive scene continued unaffected. Ranked matches, tournaments, the professional leagues, none of that depended on Runeterra's narrative coherence. But for lore enthusiasts, for people who'd written fanfiction about their summoner identity, for anyone who valued story alongside competition, it felt like Riot had just deleted a significant part of what made League special. The scariest part wasn't what was removed. It was what replaced it. Nothing. The dev blog promised future content, better stories, more freedom for creative development. But in September 2014, all fans had was an absence. The old lore was gone, and the new lore was theoretical. Champions were left in limbo, some for years. The universe felt smaller, less connected, more like a collection of separate character concepts than a cohesive world. There was backlash beyond the official forums. Reddit threads exploded with criticism. Fan sites like Factions, which had built entire community game modes around the League concept, had to figure out whether to completely reimagine their project or accept that Riot had invalidated their foundation. Think pieces appeared on gaming sites debating whether Riot had made the right choice, whether they could have fixed the problems without nuking everything, whether respecting player investment mattered when pursuing creative vision. Some defenders emerged. They argued the old lore was restrictive, that we'd gotten too attached to a flawed system, that Riot needed this freedom to tell better stories. Time would prove them right or wrong. In September 2014, though, all anyone knew was that the universe they'd known had been scrapped, and the future was uncertainty. Riot promised this was the start of something better. The dev blog talked about exploring Runeterra more deeply, about giving regions their own identities, about champions becoming protagonists rather than pawns. They said they believed in a philosophy where story springs from character naturally. They assured fans that whatever they did to reshape champions would hold tightly to their soul. But here's what they didn't say: that this would be the first retcon of many, that champions would be rewritten multiple times over the next decade, that entire storylines would be abandoned halfway through, that canonical status would become a shifting target, and that by 2024 the universe would be retconned yet again by a Netflix show that contradicted much of what had been rebuilt after 2014. The Great Retcon of 2014 wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of a pattern, a cycle of destruction and reconstruction that would define League of Legends' narrative identity for years to come. It taught Riot that they could delete their own lore without significant business consequences. It taught fans that nothing in this universe was permanent. And it set the stage for every contradiction, every abandoned plotline, every champion left behind that would follow. The Institute of War was gone, but the chaos it left behind was only just beginning. Rebuilding a broken world after you destroy a universe, you have to rebuild it. Riot knew this. The question was how and how fast, and whether they could create something better than what they'd torn down. The answer would take years to emerge, and even then, it would be incomplete, inconsistent, and constantly shifting. The first major success came with the Freljord. In 2013, before the complete retcon, Riot had already begun experimenting with region-focused storytelling. They released a massive Freljord update that introduced Lysandra, reworked Sejuani and Trundle, and completely overhauled the Frozen North's lore. The Freljord became a land divided between three factions: Asha's Avarosans, who sought peace and unity, Sejuani's Winter's Claw, who believed only the strong deserved to survive, and Lyssandra's Frostguard, who hid sinister secrets beneath their ice fortress. This was the template for post-Retcon storytelling. Focus on a region, flesh out its history and politics, give champions roles within those regional conflicts that didn't depend on the Institute of War. The Freljord update worked because it gave champions like Ashe, Sejuani, and Lysandra clear motivations that existed independent of any external organization. They were leaders of their people, engaged in ideological struggles that mattered to their homeland's future. Players responded positively. The update included interactive elements where you could pledge to a faction, and the lore felt alive, consequential, worth investing in. Riot tried to replicate this success with Shurima. In 2014 and 2015, they released Azir, reworked Xerath, and unveiled the ancient Desert Empire's history. Shurima had once been the greatest civilization in Runeterra, ruled by god emperors called Ascended who embodied the sun's power. Azir was the last emperor, betrayed by his friend Xerath in a ritual that was supposed to elevate Azir to godhood. The betrayal destroyed Shurima's capital, scattered the Ascended, and left the empire in ruins for thousands of years. Now Azir had returned, reborn from sand and magic, seeking to rebuild his empire and restore Shurima to glory. The Shurima lore was ambitious, spanning millennia and involving cosmic-scale magic. Champions like Nasus and Renekton became Azir's loyal servants, transformed by ascension into god warriors. Sivir was revealed as Azir's descendant, whose bloodline magic triggered his resurrection. Talia, a newer champion, was a young mage from a Shuriman tribe caught between the returning empire and her desire for freedom. The storylines interconnected beautifully, giving players a sense that this region had history, stakes, and potential futures. But here's where the pattern emerged. After the initial Shurima events, after Azir returned and Xerath remained a threat and the pieces were in place for an epic storyline about empire restoration versus freedom, what happened next? Nothing. Years passed. Azir's attempted rebuilding of Shurima was mentioned occasionally but never advanced. Xerath remained a threat in theory but never acted on that threat in any major way. The storyline simply froze, leaving fans wondering if any of this would ever progress or if they'd just gotten an origin story with no follow-up. The same happened with the Shadow Isles. Riot revealed that these haunted islands were once the Blessed Isles, a paradise of magical learning and healing. 1,000 years ago, a king from a distant land called Kamaver traveled to the Blessed Isles desperate to save his dying queen, Isolde. The king, whose name would later be revealed as Viego, tried to use the Blessed Isles' healing waters to resurrect Isolde. Instead, he triggered a cataclysm called the Ruination, corrupting the islands with death magic and transforming its inhabitants into undead horrors. The Blessed Isles became the Shadow Isles, and the king became a wraith known as the Ruined King, endlessly searching for fragments of his queen's shattered soul. This backstory was compelling, tragic, and ripe for expansion. Champions like Callista, Hecarim, Thresh, and Yorick all had their origins tied to the Ruination. The threat of the black mist spreading from the Shadow Isles endangered all of Runeterra. Players wanted to know more about Viego, about whether Isolde could be saved or should be saved, about how the Ruination might be reversed or contained. But again, after the initial lore drops, progress stalled. The Shadow Isles remained mysterious, threatening, and largely static for years. Bilgewater got its moment in 2015 with the Burning Tides event. This was peak post-Retcon Riot storytelling. They released a special game mode where players fought the undead horrors of the harrowing. They published comics showing Gangplank's apparent death and Misfortune's rise to power. They introduced Tom Kench and reworked several Bilgewater champions. The event felt alive with consequences that mattered. Gangplank was actually disabled in-game for a week, creating the illusion that his death was permanent. When he returned, his lore reflected his recovery and vengeance. Burning Tides showed what Riot could do when they fully committed to an event. The problem was that it also showed how resource-intensive these events were and how rarely Riot could sustain that level of coordination. After burning tides, years would pass before another region got similar treatment. The next major events would be smaller, more focused on champion releases than on advancing regional storylines. Individual champions received updates with varying success. Some thrived in the new framework. Poppy's rework transformed her from a joke character into a humble Yordle warrior carrying Damasia's sacred hammer, seeking its true wielder while unknowing that she herself was the chosen one. The new lore added depth and irony to her character. Galio became Damasia's living statue, a colossus animated by magic that he paradoxically fought against, since Demacia feared and persecuted mages. His existence embodied Damasia's contradictions. Others didn't fare as well. Yorick, a champion desperately needing a rework, had his lore changed to make him a survivor of the Ruination, a gravedigger from the Blessed Isles who now shepherded lost souls in the Shadow Isles. When Viego was finally introduced years later as the Ruined King, Yorick should have been central to the story. Instead, he was barely mentioned in the Ruination event, another example of champions being rewritten and then forgotten. The Darkin received multiple revisions. Initially mysterious, they were revealed as corrupted ascended from ancient Shurima, god warriors who were driven mad and imprisoned in weapons. Aatrox went from being a mythical figure inspiring warriors to a rage-fueled entity trapped in his sword, possessing hosts to maintain physical form. Varus's lore was completely overhauled in a cinematic set to Imagine Dragon's song, As We Fall, revealing he wasn't a single corrupted archer but rather three beings: two Ionian hunters in love and the Darkin trapped in their bow, locked in eternal struggle for control. The story was touching and tragic, but it also meant Varus's old lore, where he was a temple guardian seeking vengeance, was erased. Blitzcrank's origin changed from being a sentient robot created by unknown means to being given life by a brackern hex tech crystal, potentially connecting him to Skarner's race of crystalline scorpions. Victor went from random inventor to being Blitzcrank's creator, adding layers to his character but also creating complications when Arcane would later change Victor's story entirely. Soraka and Warwick, who in old lore had a direct connection where Soraka cursed Warwick into his wolf form after he attacked her people, were separated. Soraka became a celestial being who descended from Mount Targon to help mortals, while Warwick became a Zonite criminal experimented on by Singed, transformed into a beast. Their stories no longer intersected. Fans who loved their old dynamic lost something irreplaceable. Mordekaiser received not one but multiple lore rewrites. His original story had him as a mysterious undead warlord who emerged from an alley with dark powers. Then he became a human who sought immortality and conquered much of Valoran before his first death. Then he was revealed to be building an army in the Death Realm, preparing for a second coming that would enslave all of Runeterra. Each version made him more threatening, but also meant his earlier incarnations were erased. Through all of this, one pattern became clear. Riot's approach to lore was reactive rather than proactive. They updated champions when those champions received gameplay reworks or when new champions needed backstory. They developed regions when those regions were thematically tied to upcoming content. But overarching narratives, planned story progressions, long-term plotting, these seemed absent. The lore expanded sideways, adding new characters and regions, but rarely moved forward. Events were teased and then abandoned. Threats loomed but never materialized. Champions were rewritten and then ignored. By 2016, 2 years after the Great Retcon, Riot had made significant progress. Regions like the Freljord, Shurima, Shadow Isles, and Bilgewater had rich lore. Mount Targon was being developed with Aurelian Soul's release and Tarek's rework, revealing it as a mountain where celestial beings called aspects possessed mortal hosts. Demacia and Noxus had deeper histories, with Demacia's anti-mage persecution and Noxus's meritocratic imperialism creating interesting moral complexity. But dozens of champions still had placeholder lore or stories that didn't fit anywhere. Shaco remained a complete mystery with almost no backstory. The Void champions like Kha'Zix and Rek'Sai had minimal characterization beyond being monsters from another dimension. Kindred, Bard, and other cosmic entities existed without much explanation for why they appeared in Runeterra or what motivated them. The world was bigger, but it was also more fragmented, with champions scattered across regions without always having meaningful roles in those regions' stories. Fans who'd been with League since 2009 could see what Riot had accomplished. The post-Retcon lore was more mature, more detailed, more thoughtfully constructed than the Institute of War framework. But they could also see what was lost. The cohesion, the sense that everything connected, the feeling that your matches mattered to the world, the unique identity that League had possessed. And perhaps most frustratingly, they could see the potential. All these rich regions and compelling characters and cosmic threats, just sitting there, waiting for Riot to do something with them, to advance their stories, to deliver on the narrative promises made when the old lore was torn down. The rebuilding continued, but it would never be finished. Because even as Riot added new lore, they were already planning to retcon pieces of it. The universe they'd spent years reconstructing after 2014 wasn't stable. Couldn't be, not with the multimedia ambitions Riot had for their IP, not with the coordination challenges of a growing company, not with the philosophy that lore could always be changed if it served a creative vision. The foundation looked solid, but cracks were already forming. And some of those cracks would become chasms. The Champion Retcon parade continues as Riot rebuilt Runeterra. Individual champions became laboratories for narrative experimentation. Some experiments succeeded brilliantly. Others failed in ways that frustrated or even angered fans. And a few sparked controversies that revealed deeper problems with how Riot handled lore. Let's talk about Zac. His original story had him as the Zon amorphous combatant, a blob of living goo created in a Zonite laboratory. Scientists working on the secret project grew attached to their creation, treating him like a son. When their employers discovered the experiment, they tried to weaponize Zac. His adopted parents helped him escape, were kidnapped by their employers in retaliation, and were eventually rescued by Zac, who used his powers to save them. They went into hiding together, and Zac became a vigilante protector of Zon's downtrodden citizens. It was a heartwarming story. Zac was unique among League champions. A genuinely good person with a supportive family, fighting to protect others without tragic backstory or dark motivations. His parents loved him unconditionally, and he loved them back. In a roster full of tragic heroes, vengeful warriors, and morally gray characters, Zac was refreshingly optimistic. Then Riot retconned his parents' fate. In the updated lore, his parents still helped him escape, still ran from their employers. But instead of being rescued, they died. Zac's adopted parents were killed, and he survived alone, becoming a protector of Zon while dealing with survivors' guilt. The change was small in scope but massive in impact. It transformed Zac from a champion with a happy ending into another tragic figure, manufacturing drama that the character didn't need. Fans who loved Zac specifically because his story was hopeful felt betrayed. Why did Riot need to darken this character? What narrative purpose did his parents' death serve? The answer seemed to be nothing except making him conventionally tragic. Diana and Leona's relationship underwent a different kind of retcon, one that revealed something Riot had been dancing around for years. Diana represented the moon and Leona the sun. They came from Mount Targon, where the Solari worshipped the sun and had driven the Lunari moon worshippers into extinction. Diana was a Solari warrior who discovered forbidden Lunari texts and became the host for the aspect of the moon, while Leona hosted the aspect of the sun. In their original lore, they were portrayed as friends turned enemies, tragic figures on opposite sides of a holy war. But fans always sensed there was more to their relationship than Riot explicitly stated. The way they referenced each other, the clear parallels between them, the emotional weight of their conflict, all suggested a deeper connection. In 2020, Riot confirmed what fans had been saying for years. Diana and Leona were in love. They'd been childhood friends who developed romantic feelings, and Diana's transformation and the subsequent conflict between their aspects had torn them apart. This revelation was celebrated by fans, who appreciated Riot finally making explicit what had been subtext. It also prompted questions about why it took so long, and whether other champion relationships were similarly underdeveloped or hidden. The Darkin underwent continuous evolution as Riot figured out what these beings actually were. Aatrox transformed from mysterious inspiration to rage incarnate, his every voice line dripping with hatred for existence itself. Where his old lore portrayed him as enigmatic, his new characterization made him terrifyingly nihilistic. He wasn't fighting for glory or conquest. He wanted oblivion, an end to his cursed immortality, and would destroy all of Runeterra if it meant finally dying. This made him more threatening but also removed the mystique that originally made him compelling. Varus's transformation, as mentioned earlier, changed him from a single character into three beings sharing one body. The story was beautifully told through a cinematic that honored the tragedy of his new origin. But it also meant players who identified with old Varus, the dedicated temple guardian seeking vengeance for his family, lost that character entirely. New Varus was compelling, but he wasn't the same champion. This created a divide in the fanbase between those who appreciated the new depth and those who mourned the loss of simplicity. Victor's story underwent subtle but significant changes that would later be completely upended by Arcane. In pre-Arcane lore, Victor was a Zonite scientist who believed in augmenting humanity through technology, replacing weak flesh with mechanical perfection. His relationship with Jace was professional rivalry tinged with ideological opposition. Jace, from wealthy Piltover, represented progress through innovation while maintaining humanity. Victor, from impoverished Zon, saw flesh as a limitation to be transcended. They were equals intellectually but opposed philosophically, which created interesting tension. Victor's origin was updated to include his creation of Blitzcrank, the golem who gained sentience. Professor Stanwyck Pittedley, Victor's colleague, stole credit for Blitzcrank's creation, driving Victor toward his more extreme views about humanity's corruptibility. This backstory added motivation for Victor's transformation into the Machine Herald, explaining why he lost faith in human society and embraced mechanical evolution. It connected him to other Zonite champions like Blitzcrank, Echo, and Jinx, making Zon feel more cohesive as a region. But then Arcane happened, and we'll get to that. For now, understand that Victor's story in 2020 was different from both his original lore and what Arcane would portray, meaning Victor is a champion who's been retconned at least 3 times, with each version altering fundamental aspects of his character. Yorick Mori, the Gravedigger, represents one of Riot's most frustrating patterns, rewriting a champion's story and then forgetting about them. Old Yorick was the last of a family line of gravediggers, cursed to raise the dead until he'd buried enough bodies to earn his own rest. It was simple, gothic, and fit his gameplay of summoning ghouls. New Yorick was transformed into a monk from the Blessed Isles, a survivor of the Ruination who could see and control the lost souls trapped on the Shadow Isles. He sought to end the Ruination and free these souls from torment. This was a significant upgrade in terms of story potential. Yorick now had clear connections to major lore events, and his abilities made narrative sense. He was one of the few beings who understood what truly happened during the Ruination, and he was actively fighting against the Shadow Isles' corruption. When Viego was finally introduced as the Ruined King, fans expected Yorick to be central to that storyline. He had more reason than almost anyone to confront Viego. Instead, Yorick was barely present in the Sentinels of Light event, the major 2021 storyline that featured Viego. He appeared in some flavor text but played no meaningful role in defeating the Ruined King. It was as if Riot had forgotten he existed, despite rewriting his entire backstory to connect him to these events. This exemplifies a recurring issue. Riot rewrites champions to integrate them into larger narratives, but then fails to use them when those narratives finally happen. Seraphine deserves special attention, not just for her lore, but for how her entire creation and release demonstrated Riot's problematic approach to storytelling. We'll dive deeper into her controversy shortly, but for now, know that she represents a champion whose lore was rushed, poorly thought out, immediately controversial, and quickly retconned, all within weeks of her release. She became a symbol of Riot's willingness to prioritize marketing and skin sales over narrative coherence. Mordekaiser, mentioned earlier, underwent so many changes that longtime fans struggled to keep track. Was he a mysterious figure from an alley? A human conqueror? A Death Realm emperor? Each version was more grandiose, but it also meant Mordekaiser's identity kept shifting. By the time his current lore solidified, an ancient warlord who conquered through fear, died, conquered the Death Realm, and now plots to return to the living world with an army of enslaved souls. He'd been retconned so many times that players joked about Riot not knowing what to do with him. These are just examples. Nearly every champion who existed before the 2014 retcon has had their story changed at least once, and many have been rewritten multiple times. Some changes were improvements. Warwick went from a simple wolf man to a tragic figure haunted by fragmented memories of his human life. His transformation into a beast serving as both punishment and slavery to Singed's experiments. His updated lore made him terrifying and sympathetic, a monster who occasionally remembered he was once a man and felt horror at what he'd become. Other changes felt arbitrary or poorly justified. Karma underwent multiple lore revisions that altered her personality, role in Ionia, and even her relationship with her spiritual predecessor. Each version was fine in isolation, but the constant changes made it hard to develop attachment to any version of her character. The pattern that emerged was frustrating. Riot would rewrite a champion's lore, sometimes multiple times, without clear long-term planning. They'd integrate champions into regional storylines and then not advance those storylines. They'd create compelling narrative hooks and abandon them. The post-2014 lore was richer and more detailed, yes, but it was also more unstable, constantly shifting as Riot figured out what they wanted Runeterra to be. And every time a champion's lore changed, some fans felt the loss. Maybe you loved old Soraka's connection to Warwick. Maybe old Varus's simple revenge story resonated with you. Maybe you identified with Zack having a happy family. These aren't minor changes when you've invested years into characters. Each retcon rewrites not just fictional history but the relationship players have with these champions. Riot's defenders argued that this flexibility allowed for better stories, that being willing to change what wasn't working was a sign of good creative management. Critics countered that it showed a lack of planning, a disrespect for continuity, and a willingness to erase fan investment whenever convenient. Both sides had valid points. But as we'll see with Seraphine and later with the Ruination event and Arcane, the problems with constant retcons would only get worse. The Seraphine disaster. Seraphine's launch on October 29, 2020, in patch 10.22, was unlike any champion release in League of Legends history, and not in a good way. Her arrival sparked immediate controversy that exposed multiple issues with how Riot approached champion creation, storytelling, and community engagement. Understanding what went wrong requires examining not just her lore but her entire marketing campaign and the decisions that led to one of League's most divisive champions. Riot didn't announce Seraphine through the usual channels. Instead, they created social media accounts for her Twitter, Instagram, and began posting from her perspective. The posts portrayed Seraphine as a real person, a young woman from China living in an American city, working at her father's boba tea shop, dreaming of becoming a musician. She posted selfies, snippets of songs she was working on, anxieties about her talent, and excitement about possibly collaborating with K/DA, League's fictional pop group. This social media campaign ran for months before her official reveal. The intention was to build personal connection with the character, to let players get to know Seraphine as a person before she became a playable champion. Riot employee Brittany Higa, who wrote these posts, drew from her own experiences with self-doubt and imposter syndrome, trying to create an authentic voice. Many players found it charming, following along with Seraphine's journey and her eventual K/DA audition. Others found it deeply uncomfortable. The marketing blurred lines between fictional character and real person in ways that felt manipulative. Seraphine asked followers for encouragement, posted about her insecurities, and seemed vulnerable, all while being a corporate creation designed to sell a champion and skins. When fans later discovered the account was marketing for a League champion, some felt deceived. They'd thought they were supporting a real up-and-coming musician, not being sold a product. Then came her official reveal and the lore. In Runeterra, Seraphine was from Piltover, born with the ability to hear the souls and emotions of people around her. The noise overwhelmed her until her parents, concerned for her well-being, built her a special stage platform that could amplify her empathic abilities. The platform was powered by a Hextech crystal. Here's where the disaster truly began. In League of Legends lore, Hextech crystals weren't just magical batteries. They were brackern namestones, the crystalline hearts and souls of an ancient race of peaceful, intelligent scorpion creatures called the brackern. Skarner, another League champion, was a brackern. His entire storyline revolved around the tragedy of his people being hunted to near extinction, their crystals harvested and used as power sources by Piltovans who either didn't know or didn't care that these crystals were living, sentient beings. Every Hextech device was powered by enslaved brackern souls. So when Seraphine's lore revealed she stood on a platform powered by a brackern crystal, and that her ability to hear souls meant she could literally hear the trapped brackern screaming inside her stage, the community exploded. Players accused Seraphine of being complicit in genocide. She could hear this being's agony, could hear it crying out for freedom, and she used it to power her stage performances. Her entire champion concept, a bubbly pop star who brought people together through music, was undercut by the horrifying implications of her power source. Worse, her lore made no mention of her trying to free this brackern or even expressing guilt about using its soul. Fans called her a sociopath, a willing participant in slavery, and questioned how Riot thought this was acceptable characterization. The criticism was swift, widespread, and harsh. Mark Merrill, co-founder of Riot Games, responded on Reddit with an admission. Yeah, that wasn't cool. It was supposed to have been removed from the IP. It will be fixed. This revealed that someone at Riot had flagged the brackern crystal problem during Seraphine's development, that the decision had been made to remove that aspect of her lore, but that the final version of her story somehow shipped with it anyway. It was a failure of coordination, quality control, and basic storytelling sense. Riot quickly released a retcon version of Seraphine's lore on October 29th, the same day she launched, and Merrill responded to the backlash. In the updated story, Seraphine could hear a voice from her stage platform, but she didn't know what it was. She thought it was just magical energy, not a trapped soul. Riot quickly released a retcon version of Seraphine's lore on October 29th, the same day she launched, and Merrill responded to the backlash. In the updated story, Seraphine could hear a voice from her stage platform, but she didn't know what it was. She thought it was just magical energy, not a trapped soul. The lore emphasized that she was doing her best, that she would absolutely help if she understood the truth, that her ignorance absolved her of complicity. This retcon happened on the same day as her release, making her perhaps the fastest retcon champion in League history. Her lore was changed before most players even had a chance to read the original version. But the damage was done. The brackern crystal issue was just one of many problems with Seraphine. Her kit was nearly identical to Sona's, an older champion who was also a musical support. Players accused Riot of creating Seraphine as a more marketable, modern version of Sona, planning to render the older champion obsolete. Her voice lines were criticized as shallow and annoying. Her character design was called generic, more suitable for a mobile game than League's roster. Her splash art looked like it belonged to a different game entirely. The KDA skin released simultaneously with her base version became another point of controversy. Ultimate skins, the highest tier in League, typically represented character evolution or alternate fantasy. Seraphine's ultimate skin was her as a K/DA member, which felt like it should have been her base form given how heavily the marketing focused on K/DA Seraphine. Players accused Riot of forcing them to pay extra for the real version of the character they'd been following on social media for months. Perhaps most damningly, Seraphine felt like a champion designed by the marketing team rather than the narrative team. Every aspect of her creation seemed calculated to appeal to a specific demographic: young, female, casual players who might buy skins but not engage deeply with League's lore. Her social media presence, her pop star aesthetic, her K/DA integration, her bubbly personality, all of it felt artificial, designed by committee to maximize monetization rather than to add a meaningful character to Runeterra. The community response was brutal. Her official spotlight video became one of the most disliked League videos in history. Reddit threads dissected everything wrong with her design, lore, and implementation. Fan artists drew satirical images of Seraphine as a villain, explicitly torturing the brackern in her stage. Some players refused to buy her or her skins on principle, seeing her as a symbol of Riot prioritizing profit over quality storytelling. Riot's response was to largely move on. They made the necessary lore changes, adjusted her kit slightly to differentiate her from Sona, and continued with their plans. Her Twitter account went silent, the social media persona abandoned after serving its marketing purpose. Seraphine remained in the game, controversial but playable, a permanent reminder of what happens when champion creation is driven more by marketing strategy than narrative cohesion. The Seraphine controversy mattered beyond one champion because it revealed systemic issues. It showed that different teams at Riot weren't communicating effectively. Someone decided to remove the brackern crystal detail, but it shipped anyway. It showed that lore quality control was insufficient, with nobody catching the genocidal implications before release. It showed that Riot would prioritize marketability over storytelling, creating champions that served brand partnerships like K/DA even if those champions felt disconnected from Runeterra. Most importantly, it showed that Riot's willingness to retcon lore extended to retconning it within days of release when public backlash was severe enough. If Seraphine's story could be changed that quickly, what did that say about the permanence of any League lore? If Riot would ship a champion with problematic lore and only fix it after being called out, how much thought were they really putting into these stories? Seraphine became a symbol, a cautionary tale about what happens when a company treats lore as an afterthought, when marketing drives creative decisions, and when audience feedback is needed to catch basic storytelling problems. Her existence in League's roster would always carry these associations, making her perhaps the most tainted champion release in the game's history. And this was all before the Ruination event, which would make Seraphine's issues look minor by comparison. Viego and the Ruination that ruined everything. The Ruined King had been a part of League of Legends mythology for years before anyone knew his name was Viego. The Blade of the Ruined King, an in-game item, had existed since 2012. The Shadow Isles had been characterized by the Black Mist and the harrowing, supernatural events where undead spirits emerged to attack the living. The tragedy that created the Shadow Isles, the Ruination, was referenced in champion backstories like Callista, Hecarim, and Yorick. Players knew something catastrophic had happened, that a king's grief had corrupted paradise into a nightmare, but the details remained mysterious. This mystery fueled speculation and anticipation. Who was the Ruined King? What had he lost? Could the Shadow Isles be saved? Champions connected to the Ruination had compelling, tragic stories. Callista was the king's niece and general, betrayed and murdered by Hecarim on the day of the Ruination, now a vengeful specter who hunted oathbreakers. Thresh was a sadistic jailer who'd been empowered by the Ruination and embraced it, collecting souls for his lantern. Yorick was a monk trying to end the curse. Makai was a nature spirit corrupted by death magic but fighting to reclaim the islands. When Riot announced in January 2021 that Viego, the Ruined King himself, would be a playable champion, excitement was massive. This was League's longest-running villain, a figure who'd loomed over the lore for years. Revealing him was a huge moment, comparable to finally learning the Joker's origin or seeing Sauron in physical form. The narrative potential seemed unlimited. Then we got Vigo's design and some concerns emerged. He looked young, attractive, shirtless with a gaping hole in his chest where his heart should be. This wasn't necessarily bad. Tragic, obsessive love can wear many faces, but it wasn't quite what players expected from a king whose grief destroyed a nation. The old lore implied the Ruined King was older, more weathered, corrupted by centuries of undeath. Viego looked like he could be on a romance novel cover. His voice and personality were similarly controversial. Viego was utterly obsessed with Isolde, his dead queen, repeating her name constantly, declaring he'd do anything to resurrect her. This single-minded devotion was his entire character. He wasn't a strategist, wasn't particularly intelligent, didn't seem to care about ruling or power. He wanted Isolde back, and everything else was irrelevant. Some players found this sympathetic, a man driven mad by loss. Others found him shallow, a stalker whose obsession had killed thousands and would kill thousands more. But the real disaster wasn't Viego himself. It was the Sentinels of Light event. Riot planned a massive multimedia event around Viego's return. It would span the League of Legends game, Legends of Runeterra card game, Wild Rift mobile game, and Teamfight Tactics auto battler. A visual novel would be released letting players join the Sentinels of Light, an ancient order dedicated to fighting the Black Mist. New skins would be released showing champions either corrupted by Viego or recruited as Sentinels. A standalone game, Ruined King, a League of Legends story, would explore Bilgewater's encounter with Viego. In theory, this coordination across multiple games and media types was ambitious and exciting. In practice, it was a disaster of inconsistency, contradictions, and questionable storytelling decisions. The problems started with the visual novel on the League client. Players created a self-insert rookie sentinel who traveled across Runeterra recruiting allies to fight Viego. The story was filled with questionable character choices. Graves was recruited in Bilgewater and immediately told to go to Demacia, where he'd presumably be arrested on sight as a criminal. Vayne, Demacia's monster hunter, teamed up with Senna, who was from a nation Demacia considered an enemy. The rookie Sentinel's dialogue options ranged from serious to meme-like jokes that felt out of place in supposedly dire circumstances. But the biggest issue was how champions were characterized. Riven, a Noxian exile seeking redemption, was written as comic relief. Diana and Leona, whose complicated relationship and ideological conflict were core to their characters, were reduced to flirting. Action, a new champion introduced during the event, had a gun that could resurrect the dead if he killed their murderer, which broke fundamental lore rules about death in Runeterra and solved problems too easily. Champions who should have been central were barely present. Yorick, as mentioned, had minimal involvement despite his entire rework being built around fighting the Ruination. Makai wasn't mentioned. The Black Mist spread across multiple regions, but the consequences felt superficial. Characters would be corrupted by Viego, fight against the Sentinels, and then be freed with minimal lasting impact. Different versions of the story contradicted each other. In the visual novel, Gwen, a champion created from a piece of Isolde's soul, imprisoned Viego at the story's end. In Legends of Runeterra, she had no such role. In some versions, certain champions were corrupted. In others, they weren't. The standalone Ruined King game, developed externally by Airship Syndicate, told its own version of events that didn't quite align with the others. Even the timeline was confusing. When did the Ruined King game happen relative to Vigo's defeat in the visual novel? The event's ending was particularly controversial. Isolde, whose soul fragments Viego had been collecting, was finally restored. But instead of thanking Viego for his devotion or forgiving him or even understanding his perspective, she rejected him completely. She stabbed him with the Sentinel's magical needle, declared she'd never loved him this obsessively, and essentially condemned him to eternal imprisonment. Viego was defeated not through strategic combat but through personal rejection. This ending had merit thematically. Obsessive love isn't true love, and Isolde had agency to reject someone who wouldn't let her die in peace. But it also felt abrupt and unsatisfying. Viego had been built up as this major threat, and he was defeated by being told his wife didn't love him. The climax of League's biggest lore event in years was essentially a breakup. Worse, the ending left loose threads everywhere. What happened to the Shadow Isles now? Was the Ruination reversible? Were the champions who'd been corrupted okay? What about Callista, Hecarim, Thresh, all the beings tied to the Ruination's magic? Did Vigo's defeat change their nature? The event gave few answers, wrapping up Vigo's personal story while leaving the broader implications unclear. Community reception was savage. Reddit threads picked apart every inconsistency, every poor character choice, every missed opportunity. Fans who'd waited years for the ruined king story felt betrayed by the execution. Content creators made videos analyzing everything wrong with the event. The overwhelming consensus was that Riot had fumbled one of their biggest narrative moments, turning an anticipated storyline into a cautionary tale about poor coordination and shallow writing. What went wrong? Several factors contributed. First, coordinating across multiple games and teams created consistency problems. Each version needed to function for its specific audience and game mechanics, leading to different takes on the same story. The visual novel needed to be interactive, so the Rookie Sentinel was central. The card game needed playable cards, so certain champions had prominence. The standalone game had its own narrative needs. These requirements conflicted, and nobody at Riot ensured consistency across all versions. Second, the event tried to do too much. It introduced new champions like Akshan and Gwen while advancing the stories of Lucian, Senna, Viego, and Isolde, while also involving dozens of other champions across multiple regions. The scope was too broad, and the execution too shallow. Characters received surface-level treatment because there wasn't time or space to do them justice. Third, the tone was inconsistent. Some moments tried to be serious and dramatic, exploring themes of loss, obsession, and redemption. Other moments were played for comedy, with characters making jokes during supposedly dire situations. The tonal whiplash made it hard to take the event seriously, even when it wanted to be taken seriously. Fourth, champions were either forgotten or mischaracterized. Yorick's absence was the most glaring example, but he wasn't alone. Many champions with connections to the Shadow Isles or Ruination had no role. Characters who did appear often felt wrong, their personalities simplified or altered to fit the story Riot wanted to tell rather than being true to their established characterization. Finally, the event highlighted that Riot still struggled with advancing lore. After years of setup, after champions whose entire stories revolved around the Ruination, after building Viego into this massive threat, the resolution felt rushed, inconsistent, and unsatisfying. And after it ended, what changed? The Shadow Isles were still there. Viego was imprisoned but not destroyed. The status quo largely remained, meaning this massive event had shaken the world but not fundamentally altered it. The Ruination event should have been League's endgame, a satisfying culmination of years of storytelling. Instead, it was more like a firework that fizzled, impressive in theory but disappointing in execution. It proved that Riot couldn't coordinate major lore events across their properties, that they prioritized breadth over depth, and that even highly anticipated storylines were vulnerable to poor execution. Fans were frustrated, disappointed, and worried about League's lore future. If Riot couldn't handle the Ruination, what did that say about other looming threats? The Void invasion that had been teased for years? Mordekaiser's return? Azir's empire rebuilding? Would those stories receive the same shallow treatment, the same inconsistency, the same failure to deliver on long-term narrative setup? These concerns were valid. But nobody could have predicted what was coming next. The retcon that would dwarf all others, that would rewrite major characters and events, that would become the new foundation of League's lore whether players liked it or not. Nobody predicted Arcane would become canon. Arcane rewrites reality when Netflix announced an animated series set in League of Legends Piltover and Zaun. Expectations were cautiously optimistic. Riot had attempted media adaptations before with mixed results. League's lore was dense, potentially confusing to newcomers, and not particularly cinematic in its original form. Many assumed Arcane would be a separate continuity, inspired by the game but not bound to its canon. After all, that's how most video game adaptations worked. You honor the spirit while making necessary changes for the medium. Then Arcane Season 1 released in November 2021, and everything changed. The show was brilliant. Stunning animation by Fortiche Production brought Piltover and Zaun to life with a visual richness that exceeded all expectations. The story of two sisters, Vi and Powder, who becomes Jinx, navigating the class divide between gleaming Piltover and polluted Zaun, was emotionally devastating and thematically complex. Characters like Silco, Vander, and Ambessa were introduced as fully realized personalities with motivations that made sense. The development of Hextech by Jace and Victor formed the technological backbone of the plot. Every episode balanced action, drama, and character development perfectly. The show wasn't just good for a video game adaptation. It was good period, earning critical acclaim, awards, and a massive audience that extended far beyond League players. People who'd never heard of the game became invested in these characters and this world. Arcane suddenly made League cool in a way the game itself hadn't been in years. Initially, Riot was vague about Arcane's canonical status. The show changed several aspects of established lore, most notably making Vi and Jinx biological sisters rather than unrelated individuals, and portraying Jace and Victor as friends and partners rather than rivals. These changes were significant but could be explained as creative adaptation. Maybe Arcane existed in its own continuity, similar to Marvel's various cinematic and comic universes. Then in October 2023, ahead of Arcane Season 2, Riot made an announcement that stunned the League community. Arcane was official canon. Not just inspired by canon, not just adjacent to it, but actual proper main timeline canon that would become the foundation for all future League storytelling. Laura DeYoung, Riot's head of IP creative, explained that the company was tired of inconsistencies that had woven their way into League's narrative across multiple games, shows, and comics. They wanted a more cohesive universe, and Arcane would be the primary source material going forward. Riot wouldn't immediately retcon every champion or story, but whenever they touched a part of League's universe, they'd align it with Arcane's version of events. For fans who loved Arcane, this was exciting. The show's quality justified making it canonical. For lore enthusiasts who'd spent years following League's story, this was terrifying. Arcane Season 1 had already contradicted established lore in several ways. If it was becoming canon, what happened to the original stories? The contradictions became more apparent with Season 2, which released in November 2024 and made massive changes to fundamental aspects of League's world. Hextech's origin. In League lore, Hextech crystals were brackern namestones, the hearts and souls of Skarner's crystal scorpion race. This was core to several champion stories, particularly the drama around Seraphine. Arcane portrayed Hextech as being invented by Jace and Victor, powered by magical crystals with no mention of brackern. The show suggested these crystals came from the Arcane, a magical realm, not from living beings. This retcon erased the brackern's central tragedy and removed a key element of Piltover's moral complexity. Jace and Victor's relationship. Original lore portrayed them as intellectual equals with ideological differences. Jace was the man of progress from wealthy Piltover, while Victor was the machine herald from poor Zon who believed flesh was limitation. They were rivals, respected enemies, two brilliant minds on different paths. Arcane made them partners and friends, with Victor serving as Jace's disabled assistant before his transformation. Their relationship was brotherly until tragedy drove them apart. This fundamentally altered both characters' motivations and arcs. Vi and Jinx's connection. Old lore had Vi as an enforcer from Piltover and Jinx as a chaotic criminal from Zon with no blood relationship. Arcane made them sisters, orphans who'd survived their parents' deaths together, torn apart by tragedy during a heist gone wrong. This change was generally well received, as it added emotional depth to their conflict. But it also meant anyone attached to their original separate backgrounds lost that version of the characters. Warwick's origin. In League lore, Warwick was a Zonite gangster named Warwick who was captured and experimented on by Singed, transformed into a beast. Arcane revealed Warwick as Vander, Vi and Jinx's adoptive father figure from Season 1, turned into a monster after nearly dying. This made Warwick's story more tragic and connected to the sisters, but it also completely changed his identity. Warwick in the game has voice lines that don't match Vander's personality at all. Singed's identity. Arcane confirmed something that had been hinted but not stated. Singed is Dr. Revek, Oriana's father. His experiments were motivated by trying to save his dying daughter. This connection worked beautifully in the show but raised questions about Oriana's status, as she doesn't appear in Arcane, or rather, appears only briefly, seemingly dying as a child. Victor's transformation. The show's version of Victor's evolution into the Machine Herald involved the Hex Core corrupting him, literally taking over parts of his body against his will, pushing him toward a plan to turn all humanity into a hive mind. This was dramatically different from original Victor, who willingly replaced his flesh with machinery out of philosophical conviction. Arcane Victor became somewhat villainous in Season 2, whereas Game Victor is morally gray, a transhumanist who believes he's helping people by offering them technological transcendence. Visual designs. Several champions' appearances changed. Victor, in particular, looks dramatically different in Arcane versus his game appearance, being more human and less machine even after his transformation. Warwick's design in the show doesn't match his full werewolf appearance in-game, looking more like a monstrous human than a beast. Caitlyn and Vi. The show confirmed romantic feelings between them, something that had been fan speculation but not canon. Their relationship was explored in depth, with their partnership and attraction being central to multiple plotlines. For players who shipped them, this was validating. For those who didn't, it felt forced. The multiverse. Arcane Season 2's Episode 7 introduced alternate realities, showing a version of Zaun and Piltover where Hextech was never invented, where several characters who died in the main timeline were alive and happy. This opened massive questions about the League universe potentially being one of many, and whether other timelines might be relevant. For some fans, this was exciting expansion. For others, it felt like unnecessary complication. Timeline issues. When exactly does Arcane take place relative to League's present day? Mbessa exists in the game but died in Arcane Season 2. How does Jinx's fate in the show align with her presence in League? Where are champions like Ezreal, Blitzcrank, Zac, Dr. Mundo, Urgot, Zeri, and Seraphine, all of whom are from Piltover or Zaun but had no role in Arcane's story? This last question particularly bothered lore fans. Blitzcrank's origin involves Victor creating him, but Victor in Arcane never shows interest in creating humanoid robots. His focus is on enhancing existing bodies, not building new ones. Seraphine's existence depends on established Piltovan culture that isn't quite present in Arcane. Ezreal's explorer adventures feel disconnected from the Piltover-Zaun conflict shown in the series. Were these champions being retconned out of existence? Altered to fit Arcane's continuity? Left in limbo until Riot figured out what to do with them? Riot assured fans they weren't going back to retcon every champion or story, that they'd weave together inconsistent threads gradually as they touched different parts of the universe. But this was cold comfort for fans of champions whose stories now contradicted Arcane's canon. If Riot had to choose between Arcane's version and League's original version, they'd clearly prioritize Arcane. The show was too successful, too beloved, too culturally significant to be subordinated to a video game's lore. The creative team behind Arcane also made their position clear in interviews. Christian Link and Alex Yee, the showrunners, said they weren't troubling themselves with strict definitions of canon. What happened in Arcane should be considered to be the truth moving forward. They wanted to tell stories that felt true to fan expectations but weren't going to be bound by every piece of established lore. If they needed to change something to make the show better, they would, and League's lore would adapt accordingly. This philosophy was both refreshing and frustrating. Refreshing because it prioritized good storytelling over rigid adherence to canon that most viewers didn't know existed. Frustrating because it confirmed that League's lore would always be secondary to other media Riot produced. The game, the thing that started it all, would have its universe rewritten to serve a Netflix show's creative vision. The community split into camps. Many fans, especially newer ones who entered League through Arcane, loved that the show was canon. It meant the characters they connected with were the real versions, that future League content might reference or build on Arcane's storylines, that the show's quality would influence the game's narrative direction. They argued Arcane was simply better storytelling than anything Riot had done with League lore before, so of course it should be canon. Other fans, particularly longtime players, felt betrayed. They'd invested years in characters whose stories were now wrong. They'd follow champions like Victor or Warwick or Jinx through multiple lore iterations, and just when things felt stable, Arcane rewrote them again. They worried that future League storytelling would be constrained by needing to match Arcane's choices, that champions not featured in the show would be neglected, that the game's universe had become subordinate to its adaptations. Both perspectives were valid. Arcane was genuinely excellent, award-winning storytelling that elevated League's IP to new heights. It introduced millions of people to Runeterra and made them care about these characters. Making it canon legitimized its significance and ensured consistency in future projects. But it was also yet another retcon, another time Riot decided established lore could be sacrificed for creative vision. Another instance of fans learning their investment in existing stories didn't guarantee those stories would remain consistent. For a game that had already retconned its universe multiple times since 2014, Arcane represented perhaps the biggest and most controversial retcon yet, because this time, the impetus came from outside the game entirely. Riot announced plans to update champion lore to align with Arcane gradually. Skarner received a full rework in 2024 that completely changed his character, no longer being the last of his race but now the first of a new generation, his people living in a thriving underground society called Ixtal. Seraphine and Camille were promised lore updates to fit Arcane's canon. How many other champions would need changes? How long would this process take? Would some champions be left in indefinite limbo while Riot decided how to reconcile their stories with Arcane's world? The situation revealed a fundamental problem. Riot wanted League's universe to be both a cohesive multimedia franchise and a flexible playground for different creative visions. These goals were incompatible. A cohesive universe requires consistency, respect for established facts, careful coordination between different projects. A flexible creative playground requires freedom to change things, to prioritize what works for individual projects over universal canon. Riot wanted both, and in trying to have both, they'd created a universe that was neither fully cohesive nor truly flexible. It was a universe that kept retconning itself, where nothing felt permanent, where investing in any particular storyline was risky because it might be erased or contradicted by the next major project. And Arcane wasn't the end. Riot announced they were developing more shows set in Runeterra, potentially focusing on other regions like Ionia, Demacia, Noxus, or Shurima. Would these shows also become canon? Would they contradict existing lore as significantly as Arcane had? Would League become a game whose lore existed primarily to serve its adaptations rather than the other way around? These were open questions as of late 2024. What was clear was that Arcane had fundamentally altered League's narrative landscape in ways that couldn't be undone. The show's success meant its version of events would be privileged over anything that came before. For good or ill, Arcane was now the truth, and League's universe would be reshaped to match. The pattern behind the chaos by now, you might be wondering why. Why does Riot keep doing this? Why have they retconned League's universe so many times? Why can't they just pick a version of lore and stick with it? To answer these questions, we need to look at the patterns that have emerged across 13 years of League storytelling and understand the forces driving Riot's decisions. The multimedia expansion problem. Riot's ambitions for League extended far beyond the original game. They created teamfight tactics, an auto-battler using League champions. They launched Legends of Runeterra, a card game that needed to tell stories for every playable card. They announced Riot Forge, a publishing label for external studios creating single-player games in Runeterra. They produced Arcane for Netflix. They planned additional shows and a full-fledged MMO. Each of these projects needed stories, characters, and lore, but they also needed to function as independent products. Teamfight tactics couldn't require players to know League lore to understand what was happening. Arcane needed to be accessible to viewers who'd never played the game. The Ruined King RPG had to work as a standalone adventure. This created tension between maintaining consistent canon and giving each project creative freedom to tell its story. Riot's solution was inconsistency. Different projects told different versions of events, portrayed characters differently, and sometimes contradicted each other. The Ruination event was the most obvious example, with the visual novel, card game, mobile game, and RPG all telling slightly different stories. But this happened repeatedly across Riot's multimedia projects. Too many cooks. As Riot grew, different teams were responsible for different aspects of League's universe. The champion design team created new characters. The narrative team wrote lore. The external studios like Fortiche, Arcane, and Airship Syndicate Ruined King developed their own interpretations. The Legends of Runeterra team needed stories for hundreds of cards. The skin teams created alternate universe skins that sometimes influenced main canon. Coordinating all these teams required significant effort and clear hierarchy. When should the narrative team be consulted? Who had final say when teams disagreed about characterization? How much freedom did external partners have to interpret lore? These questions had different answers at different times, leading to inconsistency. The reactive approach. Riot's lore development was primarily reactive rather than proactive. They updated champion backstories when those champions received gameplay reworks. They developed regional lore when new champions from that region were being released. They created events around major product launches. What they didn't do consistently was plan long-term narrative arcs independent of other business needs. This meant storylines started and stopped based on product cycles rather than narrative logic. The Freljord Civil War advanced when Riot released Freljord champions and then paused when they focused elsewhere. Azir's return was exciting initially, but went nowhere because Shurima wasn't receiving new content. The Void invasion was teased for years but never happened because Riot didn't have Void-related products to tie it to. The 2022 that never was. This pattern was most obvious with The Call, League's 2022 season start cinematic. The cinematic showed champions across Runeterra facing different threats. Kaisa and Talia confronting the Void in Shurima, Sejuani and Olaf seeking Orn's Forge, Pantheon climbing Mount Targon for revenge. Multiple short stories were released connecting to these plotlines. Everything suggested a massive multi-region event was coming, possibly the long-awaited Void invasion. Then nothing happened. The year passed without any of these threads being resolved. No Void invasion materialized. The Freljord quest for Ornn wasn't followed up. Pantheon's climb went nowhere. The season start cinematic for 2023 wasn't even set in canon Runeterra, being instead a teaser for fantasy skinlines. Fans who'd been excited about the setup felt abandoned. The threads were just left hanging. Why? Because Riot had resource constraints and shifting priorities. The lore team had plans but lacked resources to execute them. Other projects demanded attention. The MMO's development required world-building efforts. Arcane Season 2 was in production. Whatever event was planned for 2022 apparently got cancelled or postponed indefinitely, and the storylines set up in The Call were simply dropped. Talent turnover. Video game companies experience high employee turnover, and Riot was no exception. Writers who knew the deep lore left the company. New writers came in with different perspectives. This created continuity challenges. When the person who wrote a champion's original story was gone, the new writer might interpret that character differently or not know about obscure lore details that contradicted their new story. Riot tried to maintain institutional knowledge through wikis and documentation, but memory still got lost. This contributed to problems like Seraphine shipping with the brackern crystal detail that someone had allegedly flagged for removal. Nobody in the final approval chain remembered or knew about the issue. Multiple games demanding attention. Riot was no longer a one-game company. League of Legends was still their flagship, but Valorant was hugely successful and needed lore development. Teamfight Tactics had regular sets requiring thematic coherence. Legends of Runeterra needed ongoing card releases with flavor text. The MMO, still in development, required extensive world building. Resources that once went entirely to League lore were now divided. This wasn't necessarily bad. Having multiple successful games was healthy for Riot as a company. But it meant League's lore received less consistent attention than in earlier years. Major events became rarer. Champion biographies were updated less frequently. The universe felt less like an evolving story and more like a library of character profiles that occasionally received new entries. The sunk cost fallacy. Interestingly, Riot seemed reluctant to fully commit to their retcons. They'd change things but leave references to old lore in place. Champion voice lines recorded before retcons remained unchanged. Skins sometimes referenced old relationships or backstories. The summoner-focused UI elements stayed. It was as if Riot wanted to have their cake and eat it too, retconning lore while keeping elements that contradicted the new canon. This created confusion. New players seeing summoner spells and Summoner's Rift didn't know summoners were no longer canon. Champions with voice lines about the Institute of War seemed to reference something that didn't exist. The game itself hadn't caught up to the lore changes, creating disconnect between what players experienced and what was supposedly true. The priority question. Perhaps the fundamental issue was that lore was never Riot's top priority for League. Gameplay, competitive balance, the professional scene, skin sales, these drove the business. Lore was important for player investment and brand development, but when resources were limited, lore took a back seat. This meant lore could be changed when convenient, when it served other goals without overwhelming concern for existing fans. The 2014 retcon happened because the narrative team wanted creative freedom, but it wouldn't have happened if it significantly harmed the game's profitability. Arcane becoming canon was possible because the show was too successful to subordinate to game lore. Each major retcon served some business or creative goal that outweighed maintaining consistency. For fans who cared deeply about lore, this was frustrating. They wanted Riot to treat the universe with the same care they gave to champion balance or skin quality. But Riot's incentive structure didn't support that. Most players didn't care about lore deeply. Making champions fun to play and maintaining an engaging competitive environment was more important for player retention than narrative consistency. The underlying philosophy. Through all these factors, one philosophy became clear. Riot believed flexibility was more valuable than consistency. They prioritized the freedom to change things if those changes served a greater good, whether that good was creative improvement, multimedia success, or business opportunity. This philosophy wasn't inherently wrong, but it had costs. The cost was fan trust. Every time Riot retconned something, some fans felt betrayed. Repeated retcons trained the audience not to invest too deeply in any storyline because it might be changed or abandoned. Why follow a champion's development across years if their character could be completely rewritten? Why get excited about threatened void invasions if those threats never materialized? Why learn the details of regional conflicts if those details might be contradicted by the next Riot Forge game or Netflix show? Riot's defenders would argue that flexibility enabled them to make better stories, that being willing to course correct when something wasn't working was a strength, that Arcane's quality justified any retcons necessary to make it canon. They'd point to improvements since 2014, to regions that were better developed, to champions whose new lore was more compelling than their old stories. Critics would counter that a universe constantly retconning itself couldn't build long-term narrative momentum, that investing in stories required some faith they'd remain consistent, that even good retcons had costs when they erased things fans loved, and that maybe, just maybe, planning ahead and respecting established continuity could coexist with creative flexibility. Both sides had merit. But regardless of which perspective you held, the pattern was undeniable. Riot prioritized short-term creative or business goals over long-term narrative consistency, repeatedly. This wasn't evil or incompetent. It was a choice, a philosophy about what mattered most for League as a product. Understanding this pattern doesn't make it less frustrating for fans who want a stable universe to invest in. But it does explain why League's lore is the way it is, why retcons keep happening, and why they'll likely continue happening as long as Riot believes the benefits outweigh the costs. The universe will keep shifting. Champions will be rewritten. Storylines will be abandoned. New projects will contradict old canon. And through it all, Riot will maintain that they're working toward a more cohesive Runeterra, even as they keep changing what that Runeterra actually is. Looking ahead into the fog, so where does this leave us? It's late 2024, Arcane has concluded, and Runeterra sits at another crossroads. The universe has been rebuilt after the 2014 Retcon, reshaped by Arcane's canonization, and expanded across multiple games and media. But stability remains elusive, and questions about League's narrative future loom larger than ever. Riot's stated position, as of their most recent lore updates, is that they're weaving together inconsistent threads as they touch different parts of the universe. They're not going back to retcon every champion or story, but they will gradually update things to align better with Arcane and create more consistency overall. This sounds reasonable in theory. In practice, it means years of uncertainty about which champions will be updated when, how drastically their stories will change, and whether the universe will ever feel truly cohesive. Several champions are confirmed for updates. Skarner already received his complete rework, transforming from the last of his dying race to a member of a thriving society. Seraphine's lore needs revision to fit Arcane's version of Piltover and Hextech. Camille, the Hextech augmented assassin from one of Piltover's elite families, requires updates to match Arcane's timeline and technological developments. But what about Blitzcrank, whose entire existence depends on Victor creating him? What about Oriana, Singed's daughter who's supposedly dead in Arcane? What about Ezreal, Ziri, Zac, all the Piltover and Zaun champions who have no obvious place in Arcane's story? Riot has suggested these updates will happen over time, which could mean months or years. Meanwhile, these champions exist in a kind of limbo, their canon status uncertain. Are they still part of Runeterra's main timeline? Have they been retconned into alternative continuities? Will they receive new stories that incorporate Arcane's changes, or will they remain frozen with outdated lore that contradicts the new canon? Beyond individual champions, there are broader questions about where League's storytelling goes from here. Arcane ended with Vi and Jinx's story concluded, Piltover and Zaun at peace, sort of, and Hextech's future uncertain. Where does this leave the other regions? We know Riot is developing more shows for other parts of Runeterra. Will these shows also become canon when they release? Will each new show potentially retcon different regions the way Arcane retconned Piltover and Zaun? The risk is that League's universe becomes a patchwork of different creative teams' interpretations, with each region getting reworked when it receives a show, game, or major event, and then left alone until the next time Riot needs to use it for content. This approach might produce good individual stories, but it prevents the kind of overarching, interconnected narrative that makes shared universes compelling. How can you tell a story about Runeterra as a whole when each region exists in semi-isolation, updated sporadically and inconsistently? There's also the question of stakes and progression. League has threatened major world-ending events for years without delivering on them. Mordekaiser is supposedly building an army in the Death Realm to conquer the living world. The Void is an existential threat that almost destroyed Runeterra before and could emerge again at any time. The Watchers, frozen beneath the Freljord, could wake and end all life. Runeterra faces multiple apocalyptic threats, but none of them actually happen because Riot can't permanently change the game's status quo. This is a problem inherent to ongoing franchises. Comic books deal with it, superhero movies grapple with it, and League is no exception. How do you tell compelling stories about world-threatening dangers while maintaining the gameplay environment that needs to remain relatively consistent? Riot's solution has been to tease threats without delivering on them, but this approach has diminishing returns. The more threats that loom without materializing, the less threatening they seem. One promising development is Riot's announced MMO, which might provide a proper venue for advancing Runeterra's timeline. An MMO could show consequences of major events, could progress stories in ways that the MOBA can't, could give regions and champions room to develop beyond their initial characterizations. If handled well, the MMO could become League's narrative flagship, the place where the universe's story moves forward while the original game maintains its competitive focus. But will the MMO create new consistency problems? Will it contradict League lore? Will it be subordinated to Arcane's canon or develop its own take on Runeterra? Will the development process require yet another round of retcons as Riot figures out what Runeterra needs to be for an MMO to work? These concerns aren't hypothetical. Given Riot's track record, it's entirely possible the MMO's development will precipitate another wave of lore changes. There's reason for both optimism and pessimism about League's narrative future. The optimism comes from Arcane's quality, from Riot's increased investment in storytelling across their properties, from individual champion and region updates that have genuinely improved the lore. When Riot commits resources and attention to narrative, they can produce excellent results. They have talented writers, compelling characters, and a world full of potential. The pessimism comes from the pattern we've explored throughout this script. Riot has repeatedly shown that consistency isn't their priority, that they'll change or abandon storylines when it serves other goals, that coordinating across their growing portfolio of games and media is a persistent challenge they haven't solved. They've eroded fan trust through repeated retcons and broken promises. Getting invested in any particular storyline or interpretation feels risky when Riot has proven they'll change things without warning. What should fans do with this situation? That's ultimately a personal choice. Some fans have embraced the chaos, treating League lore as fluid mythology where different interpretations coexist and nothing is truly fixed. They enjoy stories as they come without worrying too much about contradictions or consistency. This approach has its merits. It allows you to appreciate good storytelling without frustration when things change. Other fans have pulled back from deep lore investment, treating champion backstories as interesting flavor text rather than essential reading. They engage with the game primarily for gameplay and only casually follow the narrative. This protects them from disappointment but means they miss the deeper richness that lore could provide. Some fans remain dedicated lore followers despite the frustrations, documenting every change, debating every retcon, maintaining fan wikis that track multiple versions of character histories. They're invested enough in the universe that even its flaws can't drive them away. They hope that eventually, Riot will develop more consistent storytelling practices and give Runeterra the narrative stability it deserves. All these approaches are valid. League's lore can be whatever you need it to be: background detail for champion selection, deep mythology for immersive role-playing, or anything in between. The frustration comes not from the lore itself but from wanting it to be something Riot hasn't consistently delivered. A cohesive, progressing, respectful narrative that rewards fan investment with consistency and payoff. Can Riot improve? Absolutely. They could plan storylines years in advance, ensuring different projects align rather than contradict. They could prioritize advancing regional stories rather than just setting up new premises. They could update champions more systematically after major changes like Arcane, reducing the limbo period. They could be more transparent about which stories are canon, which are alternate universes, and what their long-term plans are for the universe. Will they do these things? History suggests they'll do some of them, some of the time, when resources allow and when it aligns with business priorities. League's lore will continue being what it's always been since 2014. A work in progress, constantly evolving, occasionally brilliant, persistently inconsistent, full of potential that's sometimes realized and sometimes abandoned. For those of us who've followed League since the Institute of War days, who've weathered every retcon and rewrite, who've watched the universe die and be reborn multiple times, there's a bittersweet quality to League lore. We can see what it could be, what it's been in its best moments, and how far it falls short of that potential. We can appreciate the improvements while mourning what was lost. We can enjoy individual stories while regretting their lack of connection to a larger whole. Runeterra is a world between worlds, a universe that exists in multiple versions simultaneously, where nothing is permanent and everything is subject to change. Maybe that's fitting for a game about eternal conflict, where death is temporary and battles repeat endlessly. The lore mirrors the gameplay, cyclical, ever-changing, never truly resolving. We're left with stories instead of a story, fragments instead of a complete narrative, a mythology that shifts like the black mist across the Shadow Isles. Beautiful, haunting, and impossible to grasp firmly. And yet, despite everything, we keep coming back. Because even in its inconsistency, even through its retcons, even when it frustrates us, League's universe contains something compelling. Maybe it's the characters we've grown to love despite their changing backstories. Maybe it's the regions that feel like real places even as their histories get rewritten. Maybe it's the potential we see, the universe this could be if Riot could just commit to consistency. Or maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe we stay because we've invested too much to walk away, because we want to see where this goes, because we hope that eventually, someday, Riot will deliver the stable, progressing, rewarding narrative that this universe deserves. The fog hasn't cleared. The path forward isn't certain. But we're still here, still watching, still hoping that the next chapter won't be another retcon but rather the beginning of something that lasts. Closing thoughts if you've made it this far, through 15,000 words about retcons, contradictions, and narrative chaos. Thank you. Really. Thank you for caring enough about League's universe to understand its complicated history, to see the patterns behind the chaos, and to recognize both the problems and the potential. This isn't a story with a satisfying conclusion because the story isn't over. League's universe will continue evolving, changing, being retconned and rebuilt for years to come. New champions will be released with backstories that might contradict or enhance existing lore. New shows might become canon and reshape regions we thought we understood. New games will tell stories that may or may not align with everything else. We can't control that. We can't force Riot to prioritize consistency over creative freedom or long-term planning over short-term adaptability. What we can do is understand why things are the way they are, appreciate the good stories when they emerge, and decide for ourselves how deeply we want to invest in a universe that refuses to stay still. Maybe that's the real lesson here. League's lore isn't for people who need rigid canon and careful continuity. It's for people who can embrace fluidity, who can hold multiple interpretations in their minds simultaneously, who can enjoy stories even knowing they might be erased tomorrow. If you need your fictional universes to be stable, with clear timelines and consistent characterization that respects everything that came before, League will perpetually frustrate you. But if you can accept constant change as the price of admission for seeing what new stories might emerge, if you can appreciate individual narratives even when they don't connect perfectly to everything else, then maybe you'll find something valuable here. Maybe you'll discover that the journey matters more than the destination, that even an unstable universe can provide meaningful moments, compelling characters, and stories worth experiencing. Runeterra exists in the space between the game that created it and the media that's expanding it, between player expectations and corporate decisions, between what it was and what it's becoming. That space is messy, contradictory, frustrating, and sometimes beautiful. And that's League of Legends lore, a universe that was scrapped, rebuilt, scrapped again, and continues to transform with each passing year. For better or worse, this is what we have. This is what we're working with. This is the world we've chosen to care about despite its flaws. So if you enjoyed this deep dive into League's narrative history, if it helped you understand why the lore is the way it is, if it gave you context for your frustrations or appreciation for what's been accomplished, then hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on League's retcons, your favorite and least favorite lore changes, the champions whose stories you wish Riot would finally resolve. And remember, in a universe where nothing is permanent, where everything can change, the only constant is our decision to keep caring. Despite the retcons, despite the contradictions, despite everything, we're still here, still playing, still following the lore, still hoping for the next good story. See you in the Rift, or in Piltover, or in whichever version of Runeterra exists by the time you're watching this. Thanks for listening.